to tonight's event. Yes, I should have mentioned we are recording, so if you just be aware of that, if you're uncomfortable having your video on or whatever, be aware that we're recording this. So over the past year or months, we've had several events kind of on the topic related to cross-channel content strategy, enterprise content strategy. And so tonight, our speaker is going to be talking about modeling content to support those cross-channel experiences. So our three guests, our speakers, are all members of A, which is an Austin-based consultancy that specializes in content engineering and content operations. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and kind of describe their roles there, but please join me in welcoming Beth Weaving, Cody Durain, and Samuel Erickson.
Thank you, Paula. And Samuel's going to share. Excellent. So just a quick intro. You probably read this in the description, but we really want to talk about content models, how content works across channels based on content models, and talk about a specific example from within our own company. And then have some tips and tricks for moving forward with content modeling. So I'm Beth Weaving, and I'm Senior Content Engineer, ICX and UX Lead at A. And I really work in that sort of strategy and implementation. Spent a long time working within those gaps and building the relationships between those two sides of projects.
Hi. My name is Cody Durain. I'm the creative producer here at A, and I work with a lot of our internal teams, and I'm excited to walk us through a use case example of a project that we did, which involved content modeling and improving our internal processes to better create some intelligent customer experiences.
Hello, my name is Samuel Erickson. I'm a semantics engineer and also a product manager at A. I'll be kind of walking through some ideas about content modeling and that. But I also thought I'd mention I just completed the master's at the Information School at the University of Washington. So while A is based in Austin, we're an entirely distributed company. So I'm actually currently in Seattle. So happy to join you. Let's dive right in. Today, we're going to talk about how content modeling drives a modular customer experience. That's really the heart of what we're doing. So we'll start off by kind of talking through what is content modeling, how do we actually do it, and then walk through the process of using a content model and content modeling in the content creation process. We'll touch on some tips and tricks that we found while implementing content models, and then with all the rest of our time, we'll open it up to discussion on kind of whatever questions you have about what we're covering. So without further ado, we'll jump right into that crash course. So in the crash course, I'm going to both cover kind of the theoretical background of content modeling as well as how to begin building your own content models. So we're aiming for this to be kind of a helpful refresher for those of you who are already familiar with the ideas of content modeling, and hopefully a useful overview for those of you who are maybe newer to content modeling. So to start off, what do we mean when we say content modeling? Content modeling really is the work of creating formal structures that represent content types, the elements from which those content types are composed, and the relationships of those elements to each other. And before I dive into discussing content types, elements, and the relationships, I want to kind of pause and focus on the idea of structure first, and kind of have in that definition. So when we talk about structure, simply put, content structure is the organization of content within a system. Content structure is the form that content takes when it's represented in, say, a database or in an XML file, in a layout tool, or any other of a number of representations of a content object. Really, structure can be described as the containers that content lives in. And humans are meaning-making creatures. We can look at content and discern structure based on the visual cues that we see. We can determine the kind of value and usefulness of information based on how it's presented to us. If we see text that's larger and bold, we know that can indicate titles and headers, which might separate sections of text. The information that's included with a set of links might indicate, oh, the links lead to an event or an article or a video. And kind of once we start looking for those elements of structure, once we start pointing them out, it's really hard not to notice them. However, that expertise can actually get in our way. We're really good at identifying those pieces, but we need systems and processes to recognize and make sense of content in the same way. And we need to provide some means for those systems and processes to comprehend content and the content structure as well. The structure that's intuitive to us needs to be made explicit to machines. So one of the drivers for content modeling is that it's no longer enough just to provide visual content structure on a printed page. We have to be able to define structure and structural relationships in a way that software and systems can understand it and actually do something with that information. Now that we're thinking kind of in terms of structure, I want to walk through how we actually understand and craft that implicit structure of our content to take that and turn it into the concrete content model. Once you start looking for implicit structure, we can begin to describe relationships among various content elements. You can see how some content elements, like I just said, headings, those suggest containers. Some elements like bulleted lists indicate, or bullet points indicate a list. We want to take those pieces and describe them in a consistent way. And that kind of consistent description, that's what we're calling a content model. So to begin, when we are content modeling, we generally want to start at a high level and get more granular from there. So that means starting by identifying content types. And if you're familiar with the work of Carrie Hayne and Mike Atherton, how we work with content types is probably going to sound a bit familiar. So step one, how do we identify a content type? Well, content type should have a few properties. First of all, the content can stand alone in a content type. It doesn't need other information for it to make sense. One paragraph from within a long article probably won't make sense if you only read that one paragraph. One step from a series of instructions isn't very useful without all of the other steps in those instructions. On the other hand, that entire article can probably stand on its own. It doesn't need to be viewed as part of an article series in order for the content consumer to find that article useful. Also, a content type should have a consistent structure across its usage. So on our website, simplea.com, we've identified a number of content types. We've identified ones for articles and case studies, for example. So while an article and a case study, those both have titles, they both have body sections, but they're going to diverge in other structural ways. A case study might require identifying a client industry or identifying associated services, where an article won't always contain those aspects. So at first glance on a web page, those two content types might look similar, but their requirements and the purpose are different, and so they need to be modeled differently. They are separate content types. And I've mentioned some common content type names here. We have articles, case studies, podcasts, etc. It's not uncommon for organizations in the same domain to have very similar content types. If you're in a similar domain to us, you may have those same content types. However, kind of barring the use of some sort of common standard or methodology, the content types in a single industry or domain can still vary considerably. You'll probably have content types that we don't have, even if you are in the same domain. And then across different industries and domains, we can expect content types to vary even more widely. Healthcare providers will have a different set of content types than financial services, which will have a different content types than computer software. Each domain has its own needs and purposes, and the content types are really how we address and isolate that purpose of the content that we're working with. So next we have types. What do we do with types? Well, types are made up of elements. So where we just talked about types needing to be standalone, elements are the pieces of content that can't stand alone. And when identifying elements, as much as possible, we want to identify the meaning behind an element rather than how the element is expressed in a particular output. I'm going to walk through a couple examples of what that actually looks like. So for example, if we see a bulleted list in a content type, instead of identifying bulleted list as your content element, think about what the meaning that bulleted list is conveying. So in a cooking recipe content type, the required ingredients might be a bulleted list of ingredients. For the recipe content type, we'd want to identify the element required ingredients, not bulleted list. Hopefully you can see how required ingredients is clearer than just stating, oh, we have a recipe and recipe contains bulleted list. Another example, in a content type for, say, an event announcement, every time you want to mention a sponsor name in maybe an introductory paragraph of the body of that content type, you might want to put the sponsor's name in bold. But instead of including a bold element in the content type, instead you want to identify an element for industry sponsor name. Bold is describing visual presentation, industry sponsor name is describing meaning. So we want the content model to be focused on the meaning associated with the content rather than any particular visual presentation. Visual presentation is really likely to change frequently, where having that kind of underlying content model increases the longevity of the content that you're working with. And one more thing on content elements, I'm not going to go in depth but I do want to note that capturing information about each element, how it should be used and constructed, is important. So like, how many characters are allowed in a title element? How many authors can I add to a particular content type? That's information. That information about how you write or construct the content, again, not visual design, but that information about those pieces is important to kind of capture and understand. Next, I want to talk about mappings. So throughout kind of our discussion of types and elements, I emphasized how when we're identifying types and elements, we want to look at the meaning behind those elements. That helps us put together an abstract model of the content. It means the model is not dependent on one particular presentation of content. And I'll continue to talk about why that's so important kind of later in the presentation. But for now, I just want to say that having an abstract model of content helps the content be more flexible to appear in many different possible channels. The content model, again, is our abstract description of the makeup of a content type. However, we need some means of expressing that model. Mappings are what make that expression happen. I'm going to take a look at a visual example. So what we're seeing on the screen here is a couple screenshots of an authoring environment that we use, as well as the presentation. So this is an article, again, on the simplea.com website. You can see we've identified particular pieces. We have these fields where you can put information in, and those correspond to kind of the ideas of types and elements that I was just talking about. And you see that we're linking them to places on the actual web page itself. So what we're trying to do, we need to make the structure of content comprehensible to systems and processes. Here we have an authoring environment and that HTML presentation, but that could also be processes like relational databases, markup languages like XML, or kind of really any hierarchical or relational mechanism. And keep in mind, we might be delivering to multiple channels. Here we have one channel, one authoring channel, but you could easily have many sources for your content. Those kind of different sources, they need to align to ensure the consistent application and development of content. So they need to all align to that content model. So for example, you might have content in, say, Data XML or in Word that needs to get imported into InDesign. The mappings that we're identifying, they create a map that indicates how to travel from the abstract model to any content input or any content output. So in the example I just gave, if we're trying to align data structure with Word and InDesign templates, we want to make the translation from one tool set to another tool set relatively painless. That's what the mappings are oriented to. And to kind of return to our definition slide here, I want to highlight one more thing, which is we'll also very likely need to identify how our content model will correspond to one or more standards. It's some of the examples we're seeing at the bottom there. For example, many of you might be familiar with schema.org. This is a website that provides schema elements that can be applied to HTML on a web page. That allows Google and other search engines to better parse the content through the application of these schema elements, and therefore it kind of increases the search engine optimization on your web page. So if we're going to have content that gets displayed on a web page, we don't just need to identify how each of the abstract models or abstract elements get represented in HTML, or how the CMS is going to generate the HTML. We need to identify how the abstract model corresponds to schema.org elements as well. And standards, by the way, can be a very important factor in mapping across domains. So standards like schema.org or DITA account for many, if not most, of the structural needs for a lot of organizations. They can help, you can take those models and build your content models based on those. And they can help in establishing consistency in content structure between various applications. And even if you're not working directly with a standard that's telling you how to model your content, it can help. Standards can still affect how you build content models. For example, if you're a healthcare organization, you need to share electronic health information. The healthcare standard HL7 is going to have some impact on how you model your content. Kind of important to keep in mind there. And kind of discussing standards really gets to the heart of one of the reasons to build content models. So content developed today, many organizations are building content for only one output. The abstract model of types and elements is the standard for content that needs to be created and mapped. And that allows us to create that connection to that standard to any process or output that we're creating. To create omni-channel customer experiences, we need to create content that's fluid, that can be expressed in more than one way. What works for one channel, it might not work for another. So the content has to be transformed from that one expression to a different expression. What we're seeing on this slide is kind of a basic example of that transformation. It's kind of, we've drawn a line around this one particular article that you're seeing in all of these different places. And that article can be previewed in many different ways. And we don't want to just redesign or kind of copy and paste that information in many different ways. Instead, we want to draw from the central content model to show all of this variation. So once we have a good sense of our model and its composition, we can really plan how it will be transformed into all of those different expressions. Okay, that was a lot of kind of theoretical information. I'm talking through those different pieces. I want to maybe get a little bit more concrete and talk about how do you actually go about creating a content model and you start to build it. So we'll just do a brief walkthrough on that. And we start by diagramming existing content. Well, ideally, you'd want to model content before it's been created. You want to build the abstract elements based on kind of the goals and the purpose of the content. Most often, you'll be trying to wrangle content that's already been created. So what we're seeing on this slide is kind of where we start. We're taking content that already exists. This is a white paper that Simply developed, and I'm just starting to diagram it out. This particular diagram is in Lucidchart. And what we're doing is we're kind of circling each of those content elements within the content type of the white paper, and we're giving specific names to each of those pieces. I do want to note that this part of the process, it's really flexible. We use Lucidchart, but there's any number of diagramming tools out there. Even just a simple whiteboard or pen and paper can get this process started. You're just kind of looking to identify those different pieces of the content model or of your content. So at this point, we kind of have a rough idea of content types kind of going into this diagramming process. So we already know, okay, white paper, it's probably one of our content types. And when you're doing this, you want an example of the content type that's representative of it as a whole. Don't want some example that's an edge case or kind of created under unique circumstances. So we're working with, this is a typical white paper at A. That's where we want to start. Once we have created that kind of start to diagram out that abstract model, we actually want to make it concrete. And so what we're seeing here is us codifying that abstract model that we identified in the diagramming phase. So this is a Google Sheet. We found that spreadsheets kind of work acceptably for this part of the process. And you can see that abstract model that we were talking about, it's under that kind of metadata and elements column. I know it might get a little small here, but you can see title and SEO description. Those are the content elements in the white paper type that we were just talking about. And then we go all the way to the right on this image, and you can see some of the mapping, one of the many mappings for articles. So I mentioned schema.org earlier. You can see we have schema.org properties that were corresponding specifically to pieces of that abstract model. So once we have that model and mappings created, that's kind of enough to start using your content model to communicate and use as part of this process. So again, spreadsheets are fine for that. However, there's more that your content model can do, but this is where we start to run into the limitations of spreadsheets. You can make some of the things I'm about to talk about next, kind of the reuse and relationships. You can make those work in spreadsheets, but it gets a little tricky. So to make this process easier, we developed an internal tool to help us identify those kind of reuse cases and other relationships in our content model. So what we're looking at right now is just a screenshot of the tool, and I'm going to just use it to talk more effectively about those particular features. To start that off, again, on the left, we have this blue text. That is our content model again. So we're looking at white paper. You can see some of the same elements we saw before. And what we're seeing here is that types and elements, they often have a more complex hierarchy than just a type contains one level of elements. Kind of think through this. If paragraphs, they might contain link elements or other pieces. Let's say you had an address element. You'd probably break that down into street and city and state elements. In the abstract model, and we see on the right, we see some of that hierarchy. Again, this is where you can represent hierarchy in spreadsheets, but it's a little hard to do with a lot of clarity or fidelity. The other big piece that I want to talk about is identifying opportunities for content reuse across different types. So when you are creating a content model for a number of content types, you'll probably discover that some content types will often use the same elements. Elements like title or SEO description or author. Those are often needed in many different content types. And we can take advantage of those similarities of those same elements in a couple of ways. So first, the same element can generally be expected to have many, if not all, the same mappings, regardless of content type. So instead of having to recreate all of those mappings, if you say, oh, we also need title here, instead, you just reuse the mappings that you identified for the title last time. You're kind of making all of those at the same time. You're not having to recreate them. Another key point here is identifying reusable content elements is also a way you can identify content itself that can be reused. So for example, when we were modeling content on simplea.com website, we found that our content type for webinars and our content type for short video content, they both had sections that described key takeaways from that content. So we gave both of those content types an element called key takeaways. Because the key takeaways elements has the same structure, a key takeaway section that's written for one content type could simply be reused. We don't have to recreate it or rewrite it in order to do that. This can be especially valuable for items like legal disclaimers or alerts. If you're able to reuse that content and identify everywhere that it is being reused, again, through that content model, you can set up the authoring or delivery systems to draw from one source. Instead of having to find everywhere that particular text was being reused and manually edit it, by starting with the content model, we can simply edit that content once and then set it up so that the changes propagate to everywhere that that content is being used. It's kind of a key piece of why we want that reuse capability. And so in the screenshot that we see here, the column of green text, that is identifying the source of a particular element. We can identify, okay, this is a shared element or kind of otherwise. So I want to wrap up this crash course in content modeling by returning to the goals and motivations of why we're even talking about content modeling in the first place. So the content model is the plan. That's the source of understanding about the structure that aligns everyone. That's designers and developers and authors, so on, anyone who has a stake in content, whether that is publishing to a particular channel, designing content, writing content, and so on. As the content model is kind of the incredibly robust way to develop content that can be mapped into that kind of intelligent and dynamic, fluid customer experience through that kind of content reuse and content fluidity. Next, I'm going to pass it off to Cody to kind of talk about actually using content models in kind of a practical real world case.
Thank you so much, Samuel, for walking us through that crash course on content modeling. Yes, next I would like to take us through an example project within A, where our team took these approaches and put them into practice. So within A, we have a lot of material that we produce and publish in various forms and channels. Here is a simplified version of our marketing strategy map. And a lot of the content assets are transformed from place to place, depending on how the audience actually interacts with it. So for example, our podcasts are published as audio files out to a distribution channel, and also hosted on the website along with the transcript, which that written transcript itself might be in turn be associated with a related article expanding a topic. And within our written content, indicated by the green boxes here, we have articles that can feed into larger white papers as various subsections on a particular topic, as well as case studies. And with those longer form materials, they typically take the form of a PDF. Historically, like most organizations, that long form content was only semi-structured. There were headings and copy and graphics all laid out, but standard sections for reuse across other channels besides just the PDF rendering, that was not originally a priority for creating that content. Like most teams, our first thought was, how can we get this content out and connect it to our customers right away? And we just focused on publishing. But now we're looking at these assets and workflows and asking ourselves, what can we do to make this more efficient? How can we reduce the internal cost and time? And how can we create further experiences from this source content? So with this mindset, we turned our focus to case studies in particular, which will use that project as a little case study itself in walking through this example here today. So we saw that our PDF channel was high impact and resonated with our customers, but our landing pages did have some bounce rate issues, and it was very manual and laborious process in both creating the PDF asset itself, as well as all the other supporting customer touch points that are produced in that same experience. Looking at the full life cycle and post-publishing performance of this asset, we identified several improvements for our UX and several blockers in our publishing cycles to get a larger volume out that our team just didn't have the bandwidth or resources for at the time. The process was just too intense for the volume we wanted to meet in an ongoing pace. So in our project, to configure our content and improve our authoring process, this is a simplified workflow that we followed that might be helpful if your team is looking to fix a similar pain point, but not sure where to start. I'll walk us through each phase right now in an overview, and then we'll go into more detail after this. But we began with defining a clear strategy. What are the main objectives we want these assets to perform? What internal friction or pain are we facing? What are the biggest blockers? What are the biggest opportunities? Once we had answers to some of these questions and more, we went on to modeling our content. We identified our current content model and then expanded it as needed for our new approach. So a similar process to what Samuel walked us through in really taking a look at the case study, circling and labeling the different structural pieces that we could identify and imagining what other ones should be created. Then, taking that model, we worked with our reference design library and created a user interface prototypes. And this step uncovered some gaps in the original model, which we then updated. So it's an iterative process of building the model, visualizing it, and then seeing where we might have overlooked areas. Once that model and prototypes were all set, we went into development, both in content development and in actual code deployment. When the content and tool configuration was underway and they were ready to come together, it was just a matter of testing and refining any bugs for customer experience improvements as needed. So that's the overview. And now I'll walk us through a little bit more detail on some of those steps. So beginning with strategy, we interviewed stakeholders and had several internal brainstorming workshops. Some of the objectives we landed on were a need for improved landing page experiences, improve our authoring experience, and reduce the publishing and content update time. Looking at these objectives, we're able to clearly see that implementing a modular content approach could really help address all of these concerns. With it, we would have defined authoring templates, a single controlled source of content that could be reused, not in just one channel or delivery method, but across multiple pages and customer experience, and a way to introduce automation and time-saving measures into our process. So using a content model, we were would allow us to feed our content into the right places at the right time and get it pushed out faster and with more consistency. With that clear and the team aligned, we began working with our content engineers to create a content model. As part of the strategy discovery phase, we determined we would need to produce not just landing pages for all the case studies, but also a category hierarchy to group like case studies. So this collection of case studies we would refer to as project profiles. And working through the content modeling portion, we were able to identify content elements that are used across the final PDF rendering, the landing page, and the project profile listing. This process was also critical in developing an author template of sorts, because now we broke the monumental task of produce a PDF talking about this client project down to bite-sized content elements with clear directions and usage. And I will take just a quick moment aside that going through this project, we were able to identify a lot of benefits, not just for the internal marketing team, but also a lot of great benefits on all of the content and data that we were collecting and organizing and connecting together that other teams and departments within A could also pull from on a more internal side. So if there's a future project that could have some private information that's not part of the public customer experience, they could still pull from that very collected and curated information and get a little bit more access and control of that information when they're working on it in other projects. So it was a great way to get cross-team buy-in. Also, by configuring the client background and industry elements associated with each case study and project profile, we were able to reuse that across case studies without having to recreate it each time. So that was another area where we could improve automation and not have to create the same information multiple times, but have it in a single location, which we could change instead of in multiple. And with our content model created, we worked with the design team to produce some design prototypings or a rendering of these pages and assets. Going through this stage helps to visualize the content and get a better feeling for the customer experience they're working to produce. And this piece often helps identify elements that might be missing or needed to be reused throughout the different places we are configuring. So that helps further redefine and finalize the content model. This is a really important stage and sometimes takes several cycles to land on a final look and feel. One major component to consider here is linking the model to how it is actually going to be used, examining and designing how that content actually lives and connects with people in the wild. What are the different environments and locations that our customers will be interacting with this content? The strategy phase helps to define and guide this thinking. But for most teams, this is the first place where they can actually really visualize the impact and often find new and exciting additional opportunities. And sometimes we do get a little too excited here, and it can be helpful to realize and mark ideas for later phases release and not compromise the original scope. With the content model and design prototypes set, we began development. On the content side, we had a very clear idea of the content elements we needed, so loaded the historic content and identified where content was missing. This process was very helpful in realizing what content pieces actually were needing to be updated and which content might be tweaked to better fit the new modular content approach we were developing. This is currently where the team is still working on some material. Updating several case studies all at once is a pretty big task, but having it templatized and broken into pieces has been a huge help for the authoring team and given our team a direction in interviewing subject matter experts to help fill in those new gaps that we've discovered. And then, in parallel to the content development, the dev team has been underway configuring our tools and distribution channels to properly house and deliver this content. They're working off the model and prototype. Providing them a full set of requirements has really helped to streamline this stage and ensure we're building towards that right direction. The prototype design alone is not enough, as there are a lot of content elements in the model which are metadata fields and not visible to humans necessarily, but for the robots and crawlers, that interact with our content, they're very important. So making sure all of that is configured on the offset makes this process go really smoothly. This is a pretty satisfying stage as well, as we get to see all the pieces really come together and start working. One of the really exciting parts of this project in particular is having the content be housed in a single repository and be sent out to both a website distribution channel and then combined and rendered with our content elements held in the same repository to follow some configured protocol to automatically produce a PDF rendering for when customers request that asset. So having the same information used across multiple pages and that asset output has been very exciting. And this brings us to our last stage here, which is the testing and refinement phase. And although it's nice and easy to follow a diagram when it's linear, honestly, this stage really is more of a reoccurring and in line with the other stages. But before go live testing and walking through the end result, it is important to get a real sense for how the project went and how aligned to our starting strategy goals we did land. Strategy rarely survives contact with implementation as is, as I'm sure everyone on this call might be painfully aware of. But that is really a way and an opportunity to evolve and better focus efforts and results. For instance, as we were placing content elements into their different views, seeing how it felt and read through the PDF or the landing pages, there were certain changes we did identify and were able to adjust. And then going through the prototyping and testing environments, there were some additional subtle UX changes that we needed to implement. So once we start working with live content outside of the theoretical, some things just click into place and other things need adjusting, which is normal. But the whole process works together so that by the end, we really do have the best outcome moving forward and a plan to implement even further improvements.
Thanks, Cody. Okay, so the last section that we're going to talk about is tips and tricks for working with content models. And let's see if we can wrap this up and bring it back to our first ideas of modular content. So I love this slide. It really is just like, who are we? Where is our stuff coming from? You know, do we actually know where our content belongs? Who owns it? You know, so really just the very, as content strategists, I'm sure everyone is very familiar with, you know, just what is our content? Why do we do content? What is the nature of our content in the world? So the very first thing we want to do with this is identify our very first item of content that we want to model. So we're going to start small. And we're going to start with one content type. So obviously at A, we have multiple content types. So we were picking one that we hadn't built out yet. And that's what we showed in the example. There's some parameters that I would always look at for choosing a content type. Like when we talk to our clients, it's like, is it one that your department has ownership over? Is it one that you can see the full life cycle? You know where the content starts, who's doing the strategy for it, who's creating it, and where it's being delivered. And is there clear ownership, or are there multiple hands on this that you know, maybe legal department has a lot to say about it, and that might put slow down the process of creating models and getting change into the system. Is there a lot of development or creation cycles around this? So there's certain types of content that may be very graphic heavy, that maybe you may have a different department that does all of the graphic design, and that can slow things down as well. All of these can be opportunities as well, obviously, for bringing other people in. Another thing, does the content have a clear goal? Is it just random content on the website or something used for social media? Or can we actually map the customer experience impact of it? See how people are working with it? And is it already something that already people are putting metrics around? So can we measure its impact, measure who's using it. Can we put different user experience measurements around it? And that will help bring around the idea of one content type, how it can really, sorry, I lost my words there. Yeah, so if we can tie back customer experience and measurements to one individual content type that we start with, that gives us a case to go back to our business units and be able to say, this works. We need to be doing this for everything else and educating everyone on it. Okay. We want to start smart. I think everyone here probably has a good understanding of analysis and strategy. So stepping back just a little bit and referring back to how what we were talking about with content modeling and Samuel, we want to understand our own content, and that we want to identify our design, both our content design as well as our user experience and UI designs, and just really understand what's in there. So oftentimes we have a lot of legacy data, right? So that's when we talk about uncover the dirty secrets. It's like, what's hiding in there? Do we actually know everyone who touches this? What are the opportunities from here? And then sort of, can we make distinctions between different content types? So when we're working through this, talking through with Cody through elements that we found in our own case studies, one of the big things was that legacy content needed to be retouched. Obviously, we're a pretty small company. We have writers available to us who can go back and look at our items. But for a larger company and possible legacy data, this could create a pretty big roadblock. So again, that's part of choosing which content type. Is it something we can actually touch all pieces of? Next slide. Okay. And something that Paula is very conversant with, the idea of inventorying and auditing. So once we've created this structure, we've done analysis, we've taken 5% of our content and we've really looked if it works in the structure. Now we need to do some tests and see if other content fits into it. What elements did we add or move around? And are they, do they really change the impact of the content? So if a piece of content is missing that, can it still stand alone, or is it really important that it's in there? So that leads us to how much content needs rewriting, how much of the big blobs of content that we have need pulling apart and restructuring, and do we need new content to be written? So obviously, as we're going through this process, we're bringing in more people to be involved, and we're adding extra weight to the project. We've talked about creating models, and I want to talk a little bit about sharing those structured models. So we can start with pen and paper. We can start with a whiteboard in the office if you ever get back into the office. We can use Miro and online modeling tools like that, Lucidchart. It really is like start with where you are and what you have available. There are fancy tools for everything, but we can always, just start writing things down and move forward with it. And then get it into a virtual format where we can actually share it with others and have, just be able to understand the limitations of the tool. So, we've done a lot with spreadsheets. We got spreadsheets to a long way. And I know I was watching the chat and a lot of people saying, we've never seen, spreadsheets and content strategy. Yeah, the two don't go together. We all have some very, very complex spreadsheets in our backgrounds. And that's one of the things that we did with our tool, was to try and take that to the next level and allow for those complexities and relationships, really, as we build it out. How do we want to share the content model? Who do we want to teach this to, educate? And how do we want to deal with the revisions that are going to come in as we show this to other people? And it's maybe early days, but governance is always something that is sort of at the back of our mind. A lot of places it becomes a 4-letter word, but it is important. Like, who has ownership and has the final say of what changes. So when the VP of marketing comes in with an awesome idea, who gets to tell them, no, that we can't do that yet? And here's the impacts as it goes through. Right? Okay, next slide. And this is just another thing back to our case study. You know, we have a core content model, and that needed to be updated and expanded. So if we're starting with one, you've got a leg up because you don't have to go back and change anything. But if you, as you start adding more and more content types to your content model, every time you make a change, you're going to want to go back and review it. And going back to the last point a little bit too, like, let's share the vision. So understanding, again, who is involved with the content, knowing what systems the content moves through. So what are our content operations? What are our processes? What are our people involved? And how can we make those possibly work better by structuring our content, but also what are they going to change and what roadblocks might we find when we start trying to change how our content's done. You know, some people love that the content writers might get a template and know exactly what needs to be filled in, and other content writers really hate that. So balancing that line of, you know, of friction and change management conflict, it's, you know, it's a thing that I think as content strategists we get to do a lot of. And just by educating teams, knowing, finding our champions in different areas really helps, you know, shop this around and get feedback and get people on board. And part of that sharing the vision, you know, this is another thing that we saw. Obviously, as a small company, we have a little bit more insight into what's happening at the end of our delivery. So our websites, our social media, our PDF creation. As organizations get larger, knowing what every configuration change can really push out a project. So understanding that a system implementation and configuration, they're just going to need to be adjusted and need to think through that before we get too far down the, you know, we can't just hand over to developers, here's our great new plan, and expect that to be implemented. So we wanted to bring this sort of around as our ending couple of slides here to what is the reason for doing this? So content modeling, structuring our content really puts us along the path to intelligent customer experiences. And we define that through like uniquely assembled interactions, you know, an organization, a customer, the content responds to the customer's individual context. Obviously, there's limitations to pulling apart pieces of content, but the more we can put structure around something, the more we can actually change the context, change the content for the individual's context. So as a user goes through our website, we can start giving them more information based on who they are. And that's really sort of where the future goes. It also allows us to deliver to multiple platforms. So in an omni-channel world, it's really useful to be able to figure out where our different pieces of content can be displayed. And this slide just sort of pulls that all together. You know, we want our meaningful, useful content. We want to reduce our manual publishing, and we want less friction for our consumers and our customers. And that is everything. So I know that we had some questions come up through this. Larry, do you want to?
Yeah, we've got several questions queued up here. First one, and I think Cody answered this a little bit in the chat, but I'd still like to revisit it just to get so everyone can hear the answer. But Sophia asked, wait, let me get back to that question. My chat just slid. But she asked about the difference between a content type and an object. And can we use these words interchangeably, or are they different? And if they're different, what's the relationship between them?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think the short answer is we're kind of using them interchangeably. I think kind of the content types, definitely the more kind of formal way to talk about, okay, we have these distinct content types. I think maybe part of that difference is saying, okay, the content type, that's the like archetype versus the content objects, the individual instance of that content. And so whereas a white paper is our content type, the content object is like the individual white paper that we're talking about. And you can see how you can kind of use content object abstractly, but that's kind of the key difference there.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Beth. Yeah.
I was going to add to that. So if you come from a programming background and you're thinking about object modeling, that probably is more along the structure that we're talking about. But often in content areas, as Samuel's saying, you think an asset, an object is an individual instance of something. So we can pull structure from that, but we're creating structure in the abstract. We're not, we're divorcing it from that, its actual pieces of content.
Got it. And Sophia, if you want to unmute and elaborate, because I know Sophia's context, she's coming from object-oriented user experience design, which is, anyhow, if you want to elaborate, Sophia, feel free. Yeah.
Hi, yeah. I differentiate object and instance, but I know from a programming background, often there's the class and then then there's the object and then, yeah. So I just was curious on how you defined it, but yeah, I use the terms interchangeably. I sometimes think that content type can be a little bit limiting, where sometimes things that, like if you're working in a product design environment, the example that I give all the time is something like a used car salesman's product for like managing their vehicles. Like a vehicle, sometimes you don't think about that as a content type, but you might think about that as an object, and it needs to be like, you need to have a metaphor to represent it in the digital system.
Right. That makes sense.
Cool. Yeah, the next question was from Rolf. And Rolf, if you're here and want to unmute and elaborate, feel free. But he asks, was the editor on that screenshot, and this was around, I forget exactly which slide this was the editor on the screenshot used on simpleA.com in the backend CK editor? And again, Rolf, if you want to elaborate, feel free to unmute.
Nothing much to elaborate about. I was just curious about the screenshot, and the visual appearance looked like CK editor. So, and I've looked up on what CMS, and it looks like Candico is used. So, and Candico is using CK editor. So it's probably CK editor, but just wanted to make sure.
You got us exactly.
Detective Ralph.
Good eye, Ralph.
Another case.
Nice.
Yeah. Candico is the CMS that we were using, but again, like definitely the principles that we're talking about here, it's ideally you'd be able to use kind of any CMS or use kind of any methodology to build this up. And ideally, you could even, like if you're at a very large organization, you might be dealing with multiple CMSs that have to be able to talk to each other, and having kind of that content model that lives outside of the CMS is a great way to be able to talk about how do we make sure that all of our things are consistent with each other. Well, they reference this one model rather than trying to make sure they all stay in sync with each other on kind of an individual basis.
Yeah, that's the power of the mappings within the content model of, this content element means this thing, in this location, but in this other location that it's reused in, it means this other thing, and it has these other terminologies or expressions that get applied to it.
Great, thanks. And next question is Madonna Lisa. And again, if you want to, I think I know when her question was about, she asked, is the tool open source? And it was around that same slide, and maybe the slide after that had the green column of stuff. I'm not.
Yeah, that's our internal tool that we've developed, core models. We're currently using it with a handful of clients as we're continuing to develop it. And yeah, I'll let Samuel speak a little bit more to it, as I know he works pretty closely with it.
Yeah, so I said I was the product manager at A. That is one of the products that I'm managing, is that kind of internal tool. And Cody's right, we're in kind of a closed beta phase. But if that's something you're interested in or curious about, happy to talk more. Also, hopefully, at some point soon, we'll be having a public announcement about that and opening it up. So anybody can kind of get in contact and use that tool. But yeah, always happy to talk about this kind of stuff with people who are interested in this and kind of want to see those processes.
Great. Hey, and Sophia had another question about DITA, and it occurred to me as you were talking that not everyone on the call may be familiar with that. So if you could give a quick overview of define DITA and how it's used in the context of this work, and
yeah. So DITA, I think it was originally created by IBM. I'm not going to dive into the history because I'm going to get it wrong. But it is an XML kind of schema that was developed specifically around kind of technical documentation. And so it's really just a structured set of XML. So HTML is kind of a structured set of, this is how we describe things on web pages. And XML is very open and very flexible in terms of you can create any schema you want and have a specific structure. Well, DITA is saying this is a standard structure that you can use to create, to kind of write out or define different pieces of technical documentation. And lots of different industries and kind of tools can make use of DITA. So it's a good way to have kind of, if you're writing in kind of the DITA markup, that is something a lot of other people will be able to understand. And it's also really nice as a standard to be able to say, okay, well, how do we structure our technical content or our kind of technical communication content? Well, do it like this. So that's kind of where that standard comes in. But it's basically just a way of saying we're going to have a particular structured way of authoring content. And there's other pieces of why it is flexible and those kinds of things that I don't have to go into here now, but that's kind of brief background on what DITA is.
Cool. Hey, and there was, next question is it's actually more of a conversation that arose in the chat. Paula and Sophia were talking about when you were talking about like, who owns the content, your ownership, and then that led to a discussion about who owns it, who's responsible, what are the goals of the content, and then who's your audience? I guess kind of gets into some fundamental strategy stuff, but did you all see that question in the chat? And Paula and or Sophia, if you want to unmute and elaborate on that, feel free.
Well, I'll jump in just to say I was kind of just responding to that slide that Beth was presenting to say that from my own experience, I think sometimes it's also really helpful to add to that list of questions like, who is this for? Who's your audience and what do you know about them? But I'm going to take the opportunity, since I have the mic, to ask, as you were talking about personalization and presenting, content to your customers, as they're going through your website. One thing, and maybe it was in the spreadsheet images, but I'm curious about how you model content for audience, and that may be maybe more than you're intending to talk about tonight, but is that an attribute that you track or that you add, sort of this is for this particular persona or for this particular customer segment? I'm curious how you kind of structure around personalization.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. I think kind of the central idea there is when we're developing that kind of abstract model of the content, what we're really doing is we're saying, okay, what are all the possible elements that we're going to need for this particular content type? And so really it's the template that you're going to be authoring against and have all these places. So you want to make sure that if you're going to need a particular element somewhere, you have it in the content model. And then I think where you go from there is you say, okay, well, we're going to need a subset of those elements for any particular presentation. And when I say presentation, that could say, oh, this is the elements we're displaying on a web page. But you can also do that on kind of a persona basis of saying, okay, we want to show these particular elements to a particular persona. So the content model isn't saying, oh, we have all of these articles feed a particular article to a particular persona, but you can say, oh, there's these, if we want to change the structure of our content based on who we're trying to deliver it to, you'd want to identify what segments of your kind of abstract model you want to present in a particular way.
Samuel, do you want to maybe just hit on semantic models? Because we're not talking about that here, but that really, I think, answers that question too.
Right. And so I think we've talked a lot about content model. And I think, Beth, thank you for bringing it up, that kind of the semantic model is the kind of partner component to all of that, where we really want to be able to kind of link the content model to say, do we have tags that are able to describe our content? That's a really key piece of understanding what should be served to a particular person is, well, what do we know about them coming in and how does that correspond to the information that we use to categorize and kind of understand our content? And the kind of overlap between those two, the semantic model and the content model, is having semantic tags attached to our content. Well, that is an element that we need to identify. And so we're saying, okay, when we're creating this content or when we're storing it in these particular places, it needs to have these particular semantic pieces attached to it. And then you can say, okay, well, we identify those in our content model. We also are identifying them when we're building kind of that kind of whole semantic understanding of the content as well. If you want to add anything on there, Beth, feel free.
Yeah, I was just going to add from a recent client who is using a headless CMS that actually has got to the point now in the CMSs where we create the structure inside, so we can create a title, a description, and an image as well, you know, all these different type of fields inside. And then we can actually put our semantics to each of those fields and rules around them. So the semantics we may have audience, age, gender, I think some of the things that they were interested, geographic region, and they were creating variants of their content for each of those. So they may be interested in a teenage boy in the United States, or they could get even closer in terms of geography for them. Spanish speaker, female in Mexico. So there's all these different elements that can be put around them and create incredibly complex systems if you want to go that way. Like if the company is creating 100 different languages, you're already working in a very complex system. And obviously adding in personalization that's structured, the structure helps, and it's going to, when we do things like send out content for translation, having things in XML, knowing what all the variants are, that's going to make life easier, but it's not going to decomplicate the system just by adding in structure.
Yeah, and to there's another sort of perspective that, as we were talking, it came to mind of, with the personalization, that because the content model is broken down to the elements, some of the different content types, it's very easy to update them and add in, additional content element that's maybe information that we're using in another place, another piece of the organization that, oh, this experience would be way better if we have this, content also on this page or on this mobile app or whatever that we have defined over here, that we can just configure it to be, slotted in there. The Lego metaphor gets used a lot. But using that content model, you're then able to do, oh, here's this completely brand new customer experience that we've not envisioned before, but we've got all of the information and ingredients already componentized that we can assemble them as they're needed and as they're requested.
Thanks, Cody. Hey, we have a question from Kate, and I think it was contextual maybe to an earlier answer. So Kate, if you're on and would like to unmute and elaborate, but she asked, what do you think about the intersection between IA and content modeling in that respect. So that's where I think she was referring to something. Kate, are you still on the Zoom?
Yeah, I am. It was right at the end of the presentation. We were talking about the intelligent content experiences, and I'm definitely thinking about right now on our website how we need to change our IA, but how that's probably not the end of the story if we actually want to be creating the right content experience. So I'm just curious about what you guys think about how that intersects.
So IA is one of those items or terms a little bit like content strategy. It could mean so many different things. So if we're talking IA in terms of a digital experience, like the navigation of a website, the contents modeling and the IA don't necessarily have much to do with each other, because the IA is the organization of the data and the content model is the structure of that content. So it might be that we have, on our website, we have a whole resources section where we have white papers, articles, podcasts, videos. So each one of those is a content type categorized under resources. And then we can use different filters on them in that section, but we can also break those out and pull them into different areas of the website based on any kind of semantics we add. So is it strategy-based or technical-based? Do we want to show specific articles in different areas? So that the IA is more, how do we want to present that data, the structure of how do we want to try and direct our customer experiences? It's pretty, I think there's a little bit of a difference there. So.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, they both have something to service in terms of discoverability, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The content structure can really help with that discoverability, because when you look at things like schema.org, we can take schema, we can take other Dublin, that's it, the Dublin core, and we can map those to fields. So if depending on the search engine we're using on our site, and if we're using artificial intelligence, there's all different systems that can go through and pull out our data. And the more information around that content that we give them, the better the findability is going to be on those.
Yeah, so I think you kind of get information architecture, like the IEA navigation of the site and the content model like it's presented on the site. Those aren't necessarily connected right when at the point of presentation, but kind of when you're thinking of, they are connected at the other end where we're talking about, okay, how do we tag and understand our content and link that to the content model? It's like, well, that's where the IEA connection is, but it's kind of more on that back end side rather than saying, okay, here's how they link together when we're presenting them on the website. They kind of have those two pieces. But like we were saying, the semantic model is an important part to link to your content model as you're creating and thinking about it.
And we also, next question is from Laura. Laura asks, what strategies did you use to get stakeholder buy-in and development resources for this huge undertaking? And then in parentheses, or if not, strategies because it went super smoothly for you, then advice for others. And Laura, if you want to elaborate, feel free to unmute. Yeah. Well, I guess, so how did you get the buy-in and the resources to do this?
Cody, do you want to?
Yeah, sorry, I was sending a message in chat there. But yeah, I mean, we're pretty lucky that we had basically top level backing of this initiative, and it's very much culture thing here at A of practicing what we preach. So there was a lot of excitement on taking sort of our methodologies and applying it to one of those pain areas that we were sort of neglecting for some time as we were focusing on other areas. And then just team communication was super huge. Each of those sort of stages we went through touched and tapped on different teams and people, and there was a whole fun Venn diagram of overlapping agents. and team members that worked in each area. And so, you know, all of us having that shared understanding of using the content model to improve, you know, our content supply chain and our eventual output was a very unifying, you know, place that we could all be working from and working towards. And having that shared vocabulary was also very helpful. So that's a quick little answer there for you.
Cool. And maybe just to add a little bit on that, I think, Cody, you're exactly right. One of the major benefits for us is we all understand what we're talking about here. I think what we see in a lot of our clients is even just kind of the language that we're using and the ideas that we're presenting aren't necessarily a kind of second nature to those people. And so it's very much of like, how do you get buy-in? Well, there's lots of different, it's kind of the usual strategies, but starting small, not saying we're going to get a giant budget to do a huge project. It's okay, we can focus on this one little area and kind of prove that that does make improvements and that does help. And there's also, it's that process of kind of building those pieces. You can also identify and say, like, really point to the kind of pain points that you're having or the difficulties that you're having, saying people are spending lots of time copying and pasting. It sounds ridiculous, but many organizations spend a lot of their time copying and pasting between different systems to keep their content alive. And like talking about content modeling as a way to move away from that, to kind of start to implement regulated processes into that. So it's pointing those pieces. And then it's also another really powerful way to kind of motivate companies. There's a few companies out there that are doing this really well. And you can point to them and say, your competitors are already doing this. You were falling behind by not starting to implement these strategies and be able to kind of create this responsive customer experience. So those are also some strategies we found effective because, and a lot of our clients, even if the people that we're talking to are very bought in, the kind of, as you go up the management chain, there's less and less of an understanding of why this is a priority. And you really need to kind of lay out those pieces and talk about why all of that's important.
I haven't looked at the new messages in the chat, but I wonder if Cody just dropped an article in there about this exact subject. I know he's been good about it.
Yeah, a couple of things there. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Hey, we have another question from Dan, and kind of follows on to this. How do you determine ROI for the effort involved in this kind of an undertaking?
It's a great question.
Yeah, ROI is always a tricky question, right? One of the things I say is, like, a lot of the companies we've been working with recently are really trying to move from legacy systems. Some people are still on like Oracle databases. As you know, we were just talking about lots of copy and pasting. So really being able to know not just our content strategy, but our content operations. What's the reality of our current state? And being able to map that out, know our processes, allows us to sort of to show small wins. So maybe it's not saving $1 million, but it's increasing time to production. One of our clients, it takes them 6 weeks to get a piece of content onto their website, which is just astounding, right? So obviously, the more languages we add into something, the more complexity. So the better we can make, the smoother we can make our systems, the easier it's going to be to get through and get our content and our messages out to the world faster. Sorry, my dog is joining in the conversation.
Yeah. And there's sort of another way to look at it of, okay, we've got this team that's really focused on, let's say, producing content for the website. Great. And we've got, it's a team of however many people. And then, we want to release, a mobile app or another channel, right? Okay, great. Let's spin up a new team that focuses on that. And then all of a sudden we've got disparate content because different teams are producing the same information, but for different channels. And then it's, we've got a mandate from up above that we've got to have a chat bot. So I guess let's spin up another brand new team and try and overwork, this one person who's helping with everything. And then it's, and now we want to roll out 2 more language options. So 6 more teams, by being able to, sort of future-proof that using that modular approach, in the long run, it does save you a lot of potential headache later down. And I mean, the configuration is, it can be complex and a lot to sort of wrap your mind around, but it's that working smarter, not harder in the long run.
I'd also add that knowing the delivery platform and how the content, who the audience is and how the content's being used is always going to be a good thing. Even if you can't get metrics on exactly who's using it and how they're using it, starting to think that way and working with the web developers and IT teams to just understand what's happening with the content. That's always, UX metrics is a really interesting, a whole other area to go into, but oftentimes we work with metrics as in that we have these big KPIs. We have to know how many people are coming and exactly what they're doing. But we can really look at small short-term metrics. With making this change, let's study it for 3 months and see if that change works. Like, what is our sort of micro transactions, micro actions in the customer experience? How are people working with us? So if we change a description, we change images, we do these little tweaks, are they actually, can we see that it's making a difference? Are more people downloading that PDF and giving us their email? Those are the things that are going to, you tie that into marketing goals, into sales goals, and now you're starting to get real money on the table.
Thanks. Yeah, we're just about ready to wrap up. I did want to ask one last question. There was a good discussion earlier in the chat about books and other resources. We mentioned Sarah Wachter-Boettcher's book, Content Everywhere, and of course, Mike and Catherine and Carrie Haynes, Designing Connected Content. I also suggested Karen McGrain's book, Content Strategy for Mobile, which was really in the same family as those other 2 books. I'm just wondering if there are other books or resources. I know you have a lot of stuff on your site, and we'll link to that, but I'm just curious if there's other books or resources that you recommend for folks who want to get on top of this subject area.
I think you've covered the main ones there for content modeling and
Yeah, I'm definitely fishing here. I acknowledge that.
Yeah, I stole the one that's on my desk, which is Carrie Haynes' book.
Yeah. There's some customer journey books. Interesting. Alan Porter put out a book recently that's pretty interesting.
I was just about to mention that one, yeah.
I can't remember what it is called. But
the CX Trinity, Customer Content and Context, Musings and Observations on the Evolving Customer Experience. Wow. I'll drop a link in chat. Boom.
Nice. I just want to say one thing I've discovered recently. There's a book called Ontology Engineering by Elisa and I forget the author's names, but chapter 3 in that book is all about, has some really good stuff about terminology alignment. Totally germane to content modeling, I think. And I just, anyhow, that was part of my fishing expedition. I know you all are in all over the semantic stuff. I was hoping maybe you knew some other stuff as well. Yeah. Well, great. Well, Paula, you want to wrap it up and bring us home here?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Beth, Cody, Samuel. This is really terrific presentation, great information, great topic, obviously. To the folks who are still on, we have permission to share their slides, and we'll be sharing this recording. So please feel free to share it with anyone you know who might be interested or who might have missed. We will also pull together, some of these resources and put links to those on our one more plug for our Slack channel. Thank you for being here. Keep an eye on our meetup site. We do, as I said, we do this every month. So we will have another event in October that we'll be announcing shortly. So with that, thank you and good night.